History as it happens, December 1st, 2022. Voices of China.
China is cracking down on protests over its zero-COVID policy.
China and the threat spreading to the global economy with stocks down
Protests
on Monday.
and outrage are spreading across China over Xi Jinping's strict COVID lockdown.
Ordinary Chinese citizens have a message for their government. We've had enough. In cities across the country, they're protesting the Communist Party's zero-COVID strategy that's confined millions of people to their homes for months at a time. The largest demonstrations in decades, since the pro-democracy rising in Tiananmen Square. Will these protests lead to change? That's next as we report History as it Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
It's a mystery, really, why such a nonsensical policy could last for so long.
Sometimes as you scroll through your social media feeds, you see a story that really makes you stop. And instead of just reading the headline, you click on the link. And then when you're done reading that article, you find others on the same story. That's how it was for me when I saw protests breaking out in cities across China. Yes, China, ruled by a one-party authoritarian system that buries its people in state propaganda and watches their every move with sophisticated surveillance. You know, I live in Washington, D.C. There are protests here about one thing or another every single day. So when I see people marching and waving signs and chanting slogans, it's no big deal. But to see it in China, now that's remarkable. This Associated Press video shows residents of Beijing in the streets holding white sheets of paper, blank sheets of paper, a symbol of defiance against their government's zero-COVID policy. They're saying, we don't want PCR tests, we want freedom. Some chanted, Communist Party step down, Xi Jinping step down. That is bold stuff. Nearby stood dozens of uniformed police officers. Now, the party's public response to the demonstrations is to pretend they don't exist. You won't see them on state-run television, and the censors are scrubbing videos and comments from all social media platforms. At what appeared to be a news conference at the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a Reuters reporter asked spokesman Zhao Lijian whether the government would scrap zero COVID in response to the popular discontent, and awkward silence ensued.
Given the widespread display of anger and frustration at the zero COVID policy in recent days across China, is China thinking about ending it, and if so, when? Thank you.
你对此有何回应? Could you repeat the question, please?
A question from Reuters. Given the widespread display...
It is unclear where this is all going. Keep in mind, it is a developing story, and the podcast, once published, is not edited later to reflect new developments. Even as I prepare to publish this episode, a headline from Bloomberg. China's southern manufacturing hub of Guangzhou lifted lockdowns in most parts of the city, replacing them with targeted restrictions as officials try to rein in excessive curbs. So it appears that some of the demonstrations are having a positive effect, even if zero COVID is only being tweaked, not gotten rid of. It's also impossible to know if these protests will blossom into something close to the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy movement of 1989. I thought of those unforgettable scenes from more than 30 years ago when millions of Chinese demanded reforms from their leaders, only to be crushed in a bloody crackdown. This AP footage shows armored personnel carriers moving into the square, machine gun fire sending protesters scurrying for cover or dropping to the ground, shot to death. During Tiananmen Square, the upper echelons of the Chinese Communist Party were split over how to respond to the largest show of resistance to its rule since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Today, Xi Jinping has consolidated power and doesn't appear to face any serious opposition to his disastrous zero-COVID policy. Weifeng Zhong is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He analyzes Chinese state propaganda to determine what direction government policy might be headed in. Weifeng Zhong, welcome back to the studio.
Thanks for having me, Martin.
It's been a bit. Last time you were here was back in May when we were discussing this topic, but there were no major protests at that time. And if I recall, we discussed, of course, I can always go back and listen to the tape, as they say. We were talking about how the Chinese leadership, the Communist Party under Xi Jinping, might think about changing the zero COVID policy because it wasn't working. Well, we can see that has not been the case, and now we have protests. So they are set to be the largest in China since Tiananmen Square in 1989. Those lasted for about 6 weeks before the bloody crackdown. So how significant do you see these protests, and is it possible to determine whether they might grow or fizzle out?
That's a very hard question. In terms of significance, it's certainly the most significant since 1989. The scale is more spread this time.
It's all over the country.
Yeah, in a lot of major cities. I think the complaint tends to be stronger in more urban areas. It comes down to a matter of relative deprivation. Like you have seen freedom, a little bit of it. Urban life is better, right? So under lockdown, it's more unbearable when you're in the urban area than in the rural area.
They're locked in an apartment sometimes for months at a time. About Tiananmen Square, I think at its climax, 1.2 million people were in the square protesting. Yeah, it's hard to know how many Chinese are protesting COVID right now, but as you said, it's in cities all over the country where there's the most opposition to the harsh restrictions. But in rural areas, Chinese seem to be okay with it? There's more support for the policy there?
There's at least less complaint about the policy. And it's also not always in effect, in the sense that if you just know cases in your neighborhood, and the neighborhood is more spread out anyway, so you don't really see that. So in the smaller city, you don't always have lockdowns like in Shanghai, which did last earlier this year for months, right? So in Xinjiang, Urumqi was the capital city of the province, where there was the fire, devastating fire.
That's right. Fire in an apartment building where people said it was because of the restrictions, that people were basically locked inside the building. I don't know if that's been proven either way, but that's what people believe.
Right. And that's often what matters. You know, if people believe that it was because of COVID, then the discontent would grow and then gatherings would start.
You made a good point there, too, that we're talking about a relative number of people. It has been pointed out that these restrictions have affected I don't want to say relatively few number of Chinese, but it's not the majority of Chinese in a country of 1.4 billion people.
Yeah, and I think it matters a lot how the government is going to approach that in terms of like managing protests. And that would determine whether it fizzles out. There's no question in my mind that the Chinese government has tracked every single one who came out to protest. There's the COVID app, right? Without the app, without the green code, you won't be able to even buy groceries. Many protesters carry their phones when they go protest. And so that fact already allows the government to track their locations. But even without it, the facial recognition technology in China is very mature these days. So from CCTV cameras, they can recognize your face right away. And the larger uncertainty is when they will start cracking down or arresting those people. It may not be right away because that might anger more people and it might motivate more to come out on the street. But they might wait. You know, if they wait a few weeks, a couple of months, they could still arrest you and they can go back in the records and they can make it happen anytime.
Yeah, I've noticed that the police have not swept in and immediately corralled everybody who's congregated. They wait, right? They can quietly go and get you later on because they know who you are.
Yeah, and you mentioned at the beginning Tiananmen Square massacre or the crackdown of the protests. Arrests lasted months after June 4th, 1989. It didn't all happen right away. I mean, the shooting happened right away. There were high-profile student leaders who were under efforts of arresting them for months. In the end, they got them all. Some were rescued out by some rich people in Hong Kong to get them out, so some got out. So that's why we have some pro-democracy activists who were in Tiananmen Square, and now they are in the U.S., in Canada, in the Western world.
So the question of whether these protests right now will grow into something bigger or fizzle out, we really don't know. But in your view, it will depend largely on how the government handles it.
Absolutely.
They're in a tough spot, though, right? Because I'm thinking, and you would know this better than I, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want to see these protests, and they would rather them go away sooner rather than later. But if they push too hard, it could make the problem worse. When really what they need to do is change their COVID policy. But we know that's not going to happen anytime soon.
It's a mystery, really, why such a nonsensical policy could last for so long, meaning zero COVID. I see several potential explanations. Maybe they all are true to some extent. One is that Chinese vaccines, especially on the older generation, may not be very effective. And the people may not know that as well as the government does, right? And so if you loosen the COVID restrictions, more people might get affected. The consequence might be more severe on the older generation.
Sorry, we have to remember that they have been subject to state propaganda about this. They don't have the same information that you and I have here when it comes to vaccines and such.
I've seen many visitors from China to the United States, and when they came, when they were exposed to, there's such thing as a Pfizer vaccine, a Moderna vaccine, the first reaction they would often have is it safe? Is it as safe as Chinese vaccines? That's the kind of propaganda they were subject to. And China did roll out vaccines sooner than the United States did, right? And so that gave the CCP for a long while, for many months, a huge boost in credibility. This path dependency here, that zero COVID or control gave Xi Jinping a lot of success early on in the pandemic. China did open up the economy, sort of bounced back briefly. And so if now you change course, it would mean that you're admitting your mistakes.
At the Party Congress in October, he doubled down on the policy, right?
There were speculations, especially in the weeks leading up to the Party Congress. There used to be a more pragmatic faction inside the CCP. The former leader of the faction is the current premier Li Keqiang, who's still the head of the government. But he's just like an ordinary party member because he's not even in the Central Committee anymore after the Party Congress. There were speculations at the time, weeks leading up to the Party Congress, that these more pragmatic people are trying to change course of the COVID control. I built a machine that detects Chinese propaganda changes, and I've not seen any significant change leading up to the Party Congress suggesting they might change that. I'm still not seeing that.
That's right. That's your work at the Mercatus Center. You look at state propaganda to determine where policy will eventually go, right? I mean, this happens in every country, including democracies. The government wants to get its message out, but it's different in a place like China.
It's much more managed, more effectively managed.
And they have a monopoly on public information, right?
Now increasingly so. So there used to be provincial newspapers that used to say things that are not the party line. I grew up in Guangdong. I loved reading more of a defiant newspapers growing up, and I'm talking about the 90s when China were more open. They all got cracked down later on. So everybody now is towing the party line.
Weifeng, for a while there, Western media reported that there might be a change in the zero COVID policy, that they might start easing off it a little bit. But it hasn't happened. Why? Or what do you make of the fact that Western media was reporting this? Did they just simply misread the situation?
We should recognize that they have done that many times. I want to bring up every time there's a leadership reshuffle in China, and I'm talking about very broadly, every party congress, new people joining the Politburo Standing Committee, there were hopeful talking points saying that somebody is reformer, somebody is liberal-minded. When Xi Jinping first took power, Western media reporting that he might be liberal-minded because why? Because his father was liberal-minded. Well, but we don't need to be reminded that Hitler's father was just a civil servant, right? I mean, how far could that logic go? There was also speculations about changing course of COVID, like I mentioned earlier, under the leadership of Li Keqiang on the government side, and that didn't happen. And just yesterday, as we speak, there was this press conference led by the State Council saying that they're going to make an announcement in light of the recent protests in China. And people immediately started to speculate that, oh, yeah, they're easing the control. No, they just came out to say that we are still slapping you on the face. We'll just go a little lighter. I think Western observers, they should give up on the habit of being overly optimistic about China, because We want China to be better, yes, but that doesn't mean that it should affect your judgment about what really is happening on the ground.
Here's something from an Associated Press article about the protests right now. While the ruling party says anti-coronavirus measures should be targeted and precise and cause the least possible disruption to people's lives, local officials are threatened with losing their jobs or other punishments if outbreaks occur in their local areas. They have responded then by imposing quarantines and other restrictions that protesters say exceed what the central government actually wants.
In some cases, we have seen local officials trying to please Beijing, so they overdo certain things. But when you see this kind of pattern persisting for a long time, the only conclusion you can draw is that that's what Beijing wants to see.
We mentioned the fire before in that one province, which sparked these protests. So there was an apartment fire, 10 people died. The Chinese government blamed forces with ulterior motives for linking a deadly fire in the western Xinjiang region to the strict COVID measures. What do they mean by forces with ulterior motives?
It could mean what they often call foreign influence.
So foreigners making up stories about what the government's doing?
Yeah, and that's convenient for the CCP because Western media have been pretty outspoken on forced labor, right, which happens to be in the same region. It's a convenient excuse for the CCP. I don't think it's as convincing to the regular Chinese people anymore.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, what do people make of this? Because when we talk about countries on my podcast, I try to avoid making them sound like individuals, as in China did this, Iran said that, Russia wants this. When we're talking about the government or the state or the party, that makes sense. But China in this context is a huge, diverse, sprawling country with an ancient culture, a modern economy. It's trying to thrive under this one-party system and all the propaganda that entails. So when we talk about China and the protests, who are we talking about here? Cross-section of society, and what do they make of these government pronouncements that are obviously false?
Chinese people have lived for a long time now in an environment that they kind of know propaganda is not true, but they don't know what they don't know. There's only a very small fraction of the population, the younger generation, who is more tech savvy. They could jump the so-called Great Firewall so that they could see content on foreign media. All the major medias we are talking about, they're all banned in mainland China. So it's only a small fraction of those who could see those websites. They kind of know that what they're hearing from the party propaganda apparatus is not true, but they don't really know what's really true out there.
We're going to talk about Tiananmen Square, compare and contrast that situation to this, but I want to bring up something you mentioned before about how you didn't know about that. You were 23 years old when you left China in 2006, and only after that point did you learn anything about this major event. You know, Americans, any people in any country can be ignorant of their past, but it's just mind-boggling how the Chinese government was able to keep something like this a secret from you and all of your classmates.
So in the year 2006, I left mainland China after finishing college. And I went to the University of Hong Kong, the oldest one in Hong Kong, and from all the way back from the colonial era, where they trained colonial officials to work for the British colonial government. I was proud to go to Hong Kong, so I walked to the campus, and on the campus there was this gigantic bloody red sculpture, like an eyesore. So I was like, what is this eyesore doing in the middle of the campus? So I stepped closer. The inscription underneath says Tiananmen Square Massacre. That's when I knew. I was like, what the heck are you talking about? I don't think anybody died, because according to the Chinese textbook, nobody died.
Amazing. Well, American textbooks, of course, have been criticized for not being very good, but this is a different dimension of propaganda that we're talking about here. So, you know, protests often break out because of a precipitating cause. And we know what the situation was here, right, with the fire and all and the COVID measures. But is there general discontent in China these days under Xi's reign as he gains more and more power? I mean, how do you determine something like that?
That's a very important question you asked, Martin, because it goes back to the core of what gives the CCP legitimacy. Now, in democracy, we vote for leaders, right? And so the legitimacy comes from the popular vote. But it doesn't mean that when you don't have democracy, you don't need legitimacy. People still have to work for you. You have to motivate, the rest of the government to work for you. For a long time, the legitimacy for the CCP now, after the Mao era, in the post-Mao era, rests on performance. And I don't mean that by just economic growth. But it also depends on what you're promising to the people and whether you can keep that promise. COVID threatened the performance because the CCP promised to keep that under control, and it's failing even that. If you think about it, there's a serious potential consequences because if the economy is not doing well and COVID is not under control, at least according to their measure or standard, where else do you find legitimacy?
I often wonder what it would take for a substantive change in China's government. You can look back at, say, the end of the Soviet Union, which is a topic I've tackled a lot lately. Gorbachev's reforms undermined the system and brought it all down. We don't see anything like that happening here. Who are the reformers? Are there any reformers left in the upper echelons of the Chinese government? Or has Xi simply pushed everyone out who's not totally loyal to him?
He has pushed anyone else who's not loyal to him, including even those who are loyal to him. It's just that they might pursue different policies than what Xi prefers. And so now virtually every single person in the central committee of the CCP is the Chinese president's man. And there's no woman. They're all men, they're all Chinese president's men. I think the most reforming Chinese leadership, we could trace that back to Deng Xiaoping's era. But ever since then, every Chinese administration is less and less liberal-minded and is less and less reformist.
Are there any splits concerning the COVID policy in the upper echelons of the party?
I think before the party congress, we could think of the minor faction led by Premier Li Keqiang as the descending force or voice. But they were not in the core leadership. They don't matter anymore.
And the party congress was in October. Remind us why that meeting was so important.
The convention in China is such that whoever leads the party leads the government. And so come in the spring, in March, there will be a leadership reshuffle in the government posts. They will be occupied by whoever got their posts in the party leadership back in October.
During that Congress is when Xi gave himself another 5-year term, right? So he can basically be Chinese president for as long as he wants.
In the Communist Party charter, there was nothing about whether you can stay on for how long. So as the party, the head of the party is the general secretary. He could be a general secretary forever already. But he also 5 years ago did change the constitution of the country that says the head of the government, the president, could also be more than 2 terms.
And there doesn't seem to be any faction, you would know this, of course, looking to replace Xi. I mean, we talk about this a lot in the context of Russia. I mean, how do you get rid of somebody like Putin when he's surrounded by all yes men? Even in autocracies and dictatorships, there's a ruling elite or a clique around the leader that has to be satisfied with him, or they could move to replace him. And how does this work in China? Does anyone really want to replace Xi? Or are they going to stay the course, as we would say?
For anyone who's ambitious about replacing Xi, at this moment, it seems the best strategy is to be the best yes man. Because Xi Jinping himself doesn't have any sons. He has a daughter, but the daughter doesn't seem to be politically active.
You know, the reason I ask Weifeng is because China's really hurting because of his policies. Their economic growth is coming in lower than expected. It's scaring away foreign investment. The people are unhappy. I mean, a lot is going wrong right now in China after he, of course, billed himself as this all-powerful leader in the pantheon of the great Chinese leaders alongside Mao.
The question comes down to how much more can the Chinese people take? If you look back at the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution, Mao actually almost lost power briefly in the 60s. And that was because of his mistake of the so-called Great Leap Forward of industrializing very rapidly. But even then, we were talking about millions of people in China dying of hunger, right? He managed to stay in power. It's very sad to think about this, but the logic is that there's still some wiggle room for the Chinese leadership to screw up.
I think the bottom line here is that their grip on power seems secure at the moment. You know, I was asking about whether there's splits in the party. During the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy protests back in 1989, if we're going to compare and contrast, and maybe what has the party learned since then about how to handle protests, there was a split in the leadership, right, about how to handle the pro-democracy protesters who gathered in April of 1989. Now, the crackdown came about 6 weeks later in June, so this begins in April, and there was a split in the party leadership, right?
There was a split in the party leadership, especially toward the beginning in April. There was the Chinese premier at the time, Zhao Ziyang. He was at least nice and encouraging enough to go to talk to the students. Of course, he got purged very quickly afterwards. We are not seeing any of that happening now to talk to the protesters.
Talking about Zhao Ziyang.
Zhao Ziyang.
Yeah, you pronounce it the right way. On May 19th, he appeared in Tiananmen Square in a last effort to appeal for a compromise, and that was his very last public appearance. He was removed from office and replaced by Jiang Zemin. The hardliner at the time was Li Peng. He wanted the protests nipped in the bud, but this other gentleman that we were discussing, he wanted to try to negotiate, try to compromise. He maybe was open to listening to reform. I think a lot of people in China, I'm no expert on this, would like to see reform. They're not happy living under this system. Doesn't mean they want to exchange it for Western-style democracy and capitalism, but maybe a softer form of the government they're living under now. What are your thoughts on that?
That's actually the path China ended up taking after the Tiananmen Square massacre. The deal the party practically proposed was that we are not giving you political freedom, but let's go make a ton of money. That, for a long time, has been a good deal. I think that the sweetness of the deal sort of ended in the second half toward the end of the Hu Jintao era, and then certainly now it's all gone under Xi Jinping.
Really?
The economic reform started to slow down around mid-2000s. The motivation was because the Chinese leadership thought there were a lot of problems because of market reforms going too fast. There was income inequality, regional disparities, and all sorts of social problems. So it's just like some liberal talking points in democracies. They say, there are lots of social problems and the government needs to help. And so the Chinese government came in and say, we are here to help. Let's slow down the reforms.
So then in late May, Li Peng, we're talking about 1989, Li Peng declares martial law. But the party continues to suffer humiliations in dealing with the protesters, who, as I said earlier, at one point totaled more than 1 million people. The army was sent in at first, and they had to go back because the streets were barricaded. Gorbachev actually visited Beijing at this time, and that turned into a fiasco. It was an embarrassment for the party. Does the party today remember, they must, right? Remember those incidents, and they're trying to avoid a similar embarrassment? Because the way I read this history, it was those humiliations that led to the harsher repression later on.
It was the lesson that we should not let anything like that happen again. Now, there are different ways to interpret that. The CCP's version is, let's just crack them down from earlier on. Now, what happens now is different, but if you look at, China has protests all the time, actually, smaller scales. They're mostly on economic issues, pollution. Like if there's a polluting factory in the city, residents didn't like that, they will come out and protest. Probably only take a few hundreds for the city officials to say, okay, we'll move the factory somewhere else because they did not want that to expand. But the way they take care of this jeopardizes economic freedom, right? Because if a factory signed a contract to build a plant here and then you remove them away, you are hurting or compromising the economic freedom enjoyed by the factory, right? So businesses increasingly become less and less free because they have to be subject to this kind of ad hoc pacifying measures from the government. And the Chinese people have learned that sometimes protests, they work. So they come out, smaller scales, they come out. And then before they become anything bigger, their voices were heard.
When you say that the lesson that the Chinese government learned about Tiananmen Square was to nip these protests in the bud, don't let them grow, crack down, that doesn't necessarily mean violent crackdown, right? Spilling blood.
Right. And we could actually see whether something like that would happen by looking at the propaganda. So if you look at the propaganda leading up to Tiananmen Square crackdown or massacre, there was a very obvious change of how they even talk about the kids in Tiananmen Square. They used to love their country. Used to, according to the description in the newspaper, they used to love their country. They used to be good people. Toward the end, they were monsters. They were morons. We are not seeing that just yet about how they talk about protests across the country right now. It might get to that point, but if it doesn't, it might suggest that a violent, bloody crackdown may not be happening. It might be more arrests. That's very different from like shooting them on the street.
You're right. In the early days of Tiananmen, the protesters were referred to in patriotic terms. And as I mentioned, there was a split in the party leadership with some wanting to reach out and talk to them. And then by June, party elders approved a decision to put down what they called a counter-revolutionary riot. So about the post-Tiananmen deal, the so-called Chinese model, right? People would get a better quality of life in exchange for them not challenging the party's supremacy any longer. And how, COVID zero seems to be undermining that deal. Any thoughts on where we go from here?
I think that CCP is now at a very difficult position. In fact, the cause of the economic slowdown in the last few years was not really because of COVID policy. I actually did my PhD thesis on this. So the question I was trying to address was why could autocracies grow so fast, like China? But there are other examples too. And oftentimes the reason was because the government had a lot of land that they would like to see being more valuable. I enjoy talking about history with you, Martin. The historical example I have was Henry VIII, after he broke up with Pope.
I never heard of that one. Yeah, go ahead.
So very interestingly, after breaking up from Rome, Henry VIII had a lot of church land in England. But the challenge for him is how do you sell it at a high price? The crown, the British crown at the time, it took them 100 years to sell off all the land they confiscated from the church. And you can't just dump them on the market because it's worthless. So the solution they found out was you would need a good business environment for your land to be valuable because they're complementary, right, in terms of the factors of production. That's why England started to be more capitalist. Patent system was invented during that time as well, under Elizabeth I. And China is having a similar dilemma because the land is owned by the state, but they are rented out to businesses. And that's why we see the local government in China, they made a lot of money by auctioning off pieces of land to developers. And that's the source of revenues. But 2 years ago, the Chinese government changed the rule that says basically local governments, I know you guys have been getting a lot of profits from selling lands. Now the profit has to come through the central government. That basically cuts off incentives at the local level to actually provide a pro-growth business environment in China.
And since you brought up land, it reminded me that China is now experiencing a huge real estate crisis. From the outside looking in, China looks like a growing, strong power. And it is, but there are a lot of internal weaknesses there.
Yeah, so the real estate crisis you mentioned occurred after the change of policy. So the Evergrande crisis that happened just a year or so ago, it was because of the change of the incentives on the local government's part.
And the COVID policies now are hurting the Chinese stock market, the U.S. stock market. I mentioned before, companies are getting skittish about investing in plants and such. The Apple iPhone, right? Apple had to make an announcement that they weren't going to be able to build as many or produce as many of their phones or something like that because the Foxconn, where they make the parts for the iPhone, right?
Yeah, they had several locations in China, and one of them underwent some protests as well. And just I think the week before the fire in Xinjiang, that was not about zero COVID though. It was just about workers' welfare. But disruptions like this, including closures due to COVID controls, often means disruptions to productions. And it's not only affecting Apple, it affects Amazon that's making a new Kindle device, for example. And many other Western countries too, because in the end, although they owned and they make profit of their intellectual property, manufacturing, a large part of it still comes from China.
So a final thought here, getting back to how the government's going to handle these things. Do you agree that one reason why they don't have to use brute force is because they've built this massive surveillance state where they can track everyone's online behavior, they can track your face the moment you leave your apartment, they can track your phone the moment you leave your apartment?
Yeah, so when we look at all these very spread out protests now happen in China, we are impressed by just how widespread they are. But being widespread is not to the protesters' advantage. But for the CCP, it was much more embarrassing when students were gathering, millions of students were gathering in the Tiananmen Square, which is a very symbolic place. That might, looking back at history, might have justified the use of brute force. But now it's much easier. There's already footage online circulating when police in Shanghai, they just go about in the subway and then they just randomly check anyone's phone to see whether they talk about the protest. And if they did, they would ask the people to delete the content from the phone. And if you do it again, they might round you up. It's happening. It's the small-scale arrest. But if you think about it from the protesters' perspective, it's terrifying. Because you could just go out for groceries and then you can be rounded up and taken away just because you have something on your phone.
And in the end, in the final analysis, all it would take would be a sensible COVID policy. And the government wouldn't have to spend all this time and energy searching out people to arrest them.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm not a communist autocrat, so I can't get it.
It will be to anyone's benefit, maybe everyone's benefit, maybe except for Xi Jinping, for China to ease off the COVID. It will be good for the Chinese people. It will be good for the rest of the world as well. It's just hard for the CCP to admit mistakes. It's much easier to admit mistakes in democracy, which is why, it's so good to live in a free society. If you elect a leader you didn't like, you elect somebody else, and then that's how you correct your mistakes, right? And I think that's what democracies do the best, is we may not be very good at, long-term planning for things that happen 50 years down the road, and that's called industrial policy, and I don't think that's a good idea. But we are much better at correcting mistakes at the 4-year circle.
Because bottom line here is the so-called Chinese model is being put to a test, that you can give people economic freedom without political freedom or human rights. That's being put to a test. Whether it breaks under the pressure of these protests, I can't tell you.
I think nobody really knows, because this is really the first time, I think, in human history, at least in the capitalist era, that we have seen an autocratic or authoritarian regime trying to pursue as much capitalist economic growth as possible. We have not seen anything like that. The Soviet Union was not that, because it was pursuing socialism. China was the first example at the large scale to try that. And I have to say, it has been very impressive how far they have gone. I'm just not sure how more they can achieve from here.
Weifeng Zhong of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. We thank you for helping us understand what's going on inside the People's Republic of China. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to talk about the history of the commercialization of Christmas. If there is a war on Christmas, Christmas has won. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.